Okay, welcome everybody this afternoon to our last and final public lecture session on corporate due diligence obligations in the agri-food sector. My name is Christine Wieck. I'm a member of the Scientific Advisory Board and a professor for food and agricultural policy at the University of Hohenheim. And I'm going to be the moderator today. And the topic today of our session will focus on living income, living wage. But beforehand, I would briefly like to introduce the Scientific Advisory Board and the work that we have done with this book or study that we have published on due diligence. And for those who have followed our lecture series very closely over the last weeks, you know that we are 18 individual experts, plus Mrs. Bettina Rudloff from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, who have worked jointly on this work on due diligence in the agri-food sector. And the main result of our study is that we have looked at a couple of different legislations at the same time, because a lot is happening on this due diligence or sustainability frontier in terms of regulatory approaches. And among them was the German Supply Chain Act, the German Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz that was put in place about 2 years ago and is currently in the implementation phase. And then on top of that, at the EU level, the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains had been put into force, and now finally, within the last weeks, the final vote on accepting the EU directive on corporate sustainability due diligence has been agreed on at the EU level. And what we observe here is that this really shifts a responsibility to the companies to look into their supply chains and they are obliged now to either look only to their immediate close supply partner. That's how it works in the German Supply Chain Act, or they have to look into the whole supply chain when the EU directive comes into place, and the EU regulation on deforestation-free supply chains has a couple of other regulatory entry points. And we have seen and we have looked at this in our study from different perspectives. Can you move one on, please? Here we go. Because we early on realized in our discussions within the Scientific Advisory Board that just focusing on the business perspective or the trade perspective is not sufficient, because there are really different perspectives that that need to be taken into account when assessing the impacts of these due diligence regulations. And there are many different points where, depending on how you make the decision, if you decide for this route or the other route in terms of how to implement that, this can be progress and really contribute to human rights and the environment, or it can become just a, let's say, paper tiger, so that it becomes very bureaucratic and maybe the impact is not so big. And so that's why we really came up with this big matrix of perspectives. And in the last weeks, we have looked at many of these different perspectives. And today, it will be the final session where we asked how can living income and living wage be part of corporate due diligence obligations. And we have two esteemed speakers here today. His Excellency, Mr. Alex Asavano from the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana Cocoa Initiative. He is the executive secretary there. And we have Mr. Friedel Hütz-Adams here from the SÜDWIND Institute. And I guess he is one of the most well-known experts, I guess, in Germany with respect to cocoa and cocoa value chain and the cocoa market. And the order of the presentation will be that very quickly, for a couple of slides, Mrs. Dr. Iweala, who is a research associate that's attached to the scientific advisory board. She was preparing a lot in the background, doing a lot of research in order to get the study done, and she will present very briefly what we have written on living income, living wage in our study, and then Mr. Hütz-Adams will give a presentation about 50 to 20 minutes, and then His Excellency Mr. Assanvo will pick up from there. So please, Sarah, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, based on the following just 5 slides, I would like to summarize the key points by the Scientific Advisory Board regarding living wage and living income as part of corporate due diligence. So in the expert report, living income and living wage was part of the chapter on opportunities and limitations of due diligence regulations, and other topics were covered like the right to food, gender equality, and climate and biodiversity. Because these issues receive much more focus in the EU directive compared to the German supply chain law, and these issues collectively shift the perspective from a mere compliance with basic social standards to a broader equality perspective. So compared to an equality perspective, protection perspective targets the compliance with basic social standards, such as the ILO core labor standards that are also covered by the German Supply Chain Act. And they cover prohibitions such as no child labor and no forced labor. And an equality perspective goes beyond the minimum social standard. So it's not just about prohibiting certain practices, but about achieving more programmatic goals, for example, achieving a living income throughout global supply chains. And yes, the implementation of these more programmatic goals might be more challenging, a bit more complex than just prohibitions. Yeah, so how is the concept of a living income and a living wage covered by due diligence regulations in the text? So first of all, in the German Supply Chain Act, there's only a reference to an appropriate wage, whereas in the final text of the EU directive, we find the following paragraph in the annex. So that states, or that includes a fair wage and an adequate living wage for employed workers and an adequate living income for self-employed workers and smallholders, and it references the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in doing so. So this explicit mentioning of a living wage and a living income in the EU directive came maybe a little bit as a surprise, because if I'm not mistaken, in the Commission's proposal, there was only a living wage mentioned, and then later in the Parliament's negotiation position, also the living income part was added. And despite the rather tough trilogue process, that bit made it into the final text. And what is actually a living wage or living income? For the ones already familiar with the topic, you all know this graphic, and I'm sure also the other speakers are going to make mention of it. But just to start with a common ground, I would like just very briefly introduce the idea. Really very briefly. So usually the anchor method is used for calculating regionally adjusted living wages and incomes. So in the first step, it is to estimate the cost of an appropriate lifestyle for a household, which is divided into 4 expenditures. So we have food, we have housing, essential needs like education and healthcare, and also to have reserves for unexpected events. And then on the other hand, there's either the actual wage or there is the actual income of a smallholder, as we talk about agriculture, about this of a smallholder. And also here, this is made up of different components. So we have a net farm income, we have a net off-farm income, and we have other incomes, for example, other sources of income as remittances from family members that live and work abroad, for example. So, and what we know is that in rural areas in particular, non-farm income accounts for a large share of household income, also these variations differ between countries. Yes, so in order to consider a living wage and a living income as part of corporate due diligence, a few thoughts from the expert report and some examples. So generally speaking, a living wage is very similar to the concept of a minimum wage approach, but the Global Living Wage Coalition has shown in many case scenarios that minimum wages are often far below the calculated reference value for a living wage. And when calculating a living wage, one has to take into account regional differences, and it also needs to be adjusted to inflation on a regular basis in order to establish a reference value. There are already some examples that is looking at implementing a living wage. So there is the German Retailers Working Group on Living Income and Living Wages. They started off with living wages in the banana sector. This is organized by the GIZ here in Germany, and the big, large German retailers are part of this group. And another sign that the concept is gaining momentum is the agreement by the ILO, which opens the way for new work by the ILO on estimating living wages and on engaging with living wages initiatives. So on the other hand, we have the concept of a living income, which appears to be a bit more challenging, and I guess we will hear much more about it in a second. Here we don't deal with wages, but we deal with incomes in agriculture of smallholder farmers. So in some producing countries, we have farmers have small farms, and other large and income also comes from other from non-farm efforts. So the question is, what role does the price of the commodity play so that the total income is sufficient? Also, commodity prices are subject to price fluctuations that reflect changes in supply and demand. But how can buyers deal with this when they are faces of low prices? And of course, prices are an important signal in market-based systems. So there are a lot of challenges around the living income approach, but there are already very good examples where people have, or concepts, approaches have tried to tackle it. And one is the living income differential in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. And we just hear from the expert on this, so I'm not going to mention it further. But then there are also pilot projects by companies. For example, there is an income accelerator program by Nestle. I think it's also in the Côte d'Ivoire. And they are increasing calculations of living income preference prices, which are they are necessary for any approach to build on. So on the last slide, just the recommendations by the Scientific Advisory Board with regard to living wage and living income and how companies can incorporate them. So first of all, I maybe need to point out that at the point of finishing the expert report, it was not sure that the concept of the living income will be part of the EU directive. So the recommendations focused a bit more on wage. So the advisory board recommended that as a first step, companies should ensure that the local minimum wage is paid, and policymakers should assist to strengthen local systems for establishing minimum wages or to reevaluate them. As we know, they're often far short of a living wage. And further, policymakers can support initiatives to calculate living wages and incomes, and further develop antitrust laws to enable sector agreements, just like the Retailer Working Group on Living Wage bananas. And besides these explicit recommendations by the advisory board, these other two recommendations, I guess, matter in this context. And one I already touched on a second ago, the support for companies. In respect of living wage and living income, for instance, to create a database of reference values for both concepts and to keep them up to date so that companies themselves don't need to do this on their own. And the other one is here is a key recommendation by the Scientific Advisory Board to create due diligence regulations as a learning system, as these regulations are a rather new policy instrument. It is very important to gain implementation experience, review the effectiveness, and allow for adjustments if needed. So for that, it is very important to monitor the effects on the ground, also when companies need or are required to implement a living income and a living wage along their supply chains, and also to identify unintended consequences and adjustments need to be then made in case of that. So much about what the Scientific Advisory Board discussed as part of the expert report.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah Iweala, for this introductory words. And without any further interruptions, I would like to hand over to Mr. Hütz-Adams for his presentation, focusing a little bit more general on challenges and problems with living wage and living income and showing potential directions forward. And as I have said beforehand already, you are working with the SÜDWIND Institute, and if I have seen that correctly already since a couple of years, since probably more than 20 years, if I have calculated it correctly, and you have published a number of very influential studies on the cocoa value chain, on price formation in the cocoa market, and in particular also on the responsibility of processing companies, of chocolate producing companies, on how to better include the price, how to improve the price formation, and to step up the responsibility for the producers of the cocoa beans, and how to improve market functioning. And with this, I would like to hand over, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here, because I think it's very important that this discussion on price and living income goes deeper into the university, because at the university, the people are trained who are later in the companies. So it is a different thinking from what I have learned, for example, in the 80s when I studied economies. It was at that time it was all fixed on market price. And now we talk suddenly about human rights and about people in a value chain, and that is a different approach, which is very important. And with the example of cocoa, I will show why, and also that I will show that there's still a lot to do. I will now share my screen, and I hope you can see it.
We can see it, yes, but not yet in the presentation mode. Yes, now it's in the presentation mode.
Okay. The question I had to discuss today is something which usually takes much more than 20 minutes, but I will try it. And how can a living income and a living wage be part of corporate due diligence obligations? And I will do this, as mentioned, at the example of cocoa. Alex will later go on deeper into the price disruptions we have seen in the market in the last 12 months. I will base my presentation mostly on the long-term trend we have seen in the cocoa sector, because the last months were extraordinary, and this is more something for a discussion. I have a spoiler now, because we often hear the discussions, isn't the concept of a living wage or a living income something from the West, introduced from the North and the South, and do people understand it on the ground? This is a song from the 1950s in Ghana. If you want to send your children in school, it's cocoa. If you want to build a house, it's cocoa. If you want to marry, if you want to buy clothes, if you want to buy a lorry, meaning expanding your business all in the world, what you want to do is cocoa money, you can do it. So people already there in this song have a concept of a living income. It should be enough to send your children in school, to have decent clothing, to have a decent housing. And it's something which is very deep rooted within families and traditions and history. I will come back to this. Now we look into the reality on the ground if we go into the cocoa sector. Cocoa is a typical agricultural product on one hand because it's produced by millions of people. A little bit different from some other crops is that it's still mostly harvested by small-scale farmers. So it's only a small percentage of a global harvest coming from big plantations. There's an extreme variety in yields. It can be very extensively in forest and you have only a few kilo per hectare. It can be with irrigation systems. It all depends on agricultural practices, weather, age of trees, availability of fertilizer and pesticides, labor input, and that means on price, because for all things you have to pay. If you look into the most important producing countries, Côte d'Ivoire, we have a global harvest during the last years of roughly 5 million tons. 2 million tons come from Côte d'Ivoire alone. At least 1 million farming households, 7 people per household. So you have a population of 28 million and 7 million people dependent on cocoa. So if the cocoa price goes down, it's a disaster for the whole country. They are so strongly dependent on cocoa. Most farmers are here small-scale farmers. Most farms are below 4 hectares. And yields are roughly around 500 kilo per hectare. Ghana, 700,000 tons of production during the last decade on average. Last year, or the ongoing year is much different. 800,000 families, 6 people per household, again, millions of people dependent on cocoa and very small farms, 2 hectares on average roughly, and also low yields. This is production. Production is concentrated in West Africa. West African production is roughly 75% of global production. Latin America and Asia are much smaller, as you can see here in the brown dots. This is consumption. Half of the global cocoa consumption is in Europe. So it's one of these goods which are produced in countries which don't eat it. There is no big consumption on the African continent. They are completely dependent on export. And this means they are completely dependent on pricing on the global market. Latin America is a little bit different because they have some countries like Brazil, for example, they even import nowadays cocoa beans a little bit. They have a big local market. But for West Africa, there's a complete dependence on exports. What we see now in cocoa production, like in many agricultural products, it is a lot of labor connected to it. You have to grow the seedlings. You have to look after the seedlings if you plant them on your plantations, because small trees, they don't like the sun. So we need to plant shadow plants later on. You have to weed your plantation. You have to prune trees. You have to look after your trees. And it's labor intensive to harvest. You see here that fruits do not become ripe at the same time. So it's not like cherries in Germany that for 2 or 3 weeks, everything is over. It's a harvest which goes on for months. There's a main harvest and a side harvest. Then you have to open the fruits. You have to ferment them, because no fermentation means they don't taste. You have to dry them, which is not easy in a tropical country. And then you fill them in, on average, 64 kilo bags. Cocoa is a good example for many products which are labor intensive, which are export oriented. And you can go to coffee, you can go to mango, which we buy in the supermarkets here, and all the tropical fruits like bananas. A big difference is indeed, as I mentioned, that it's completely in the hand of smallholders. Coffee is more mixed, bananas also, but here with cocoa, you are in a smallholder society. You are in remote villages, this is a picture from Ghana. which also shows you, you see the condition of a road, that the infrastructure is not very good and that there are high transport costs connected to it. What comes from these villages then goes by truck into huge warehouses, into factories which to run efficiently use 10,000s of tons. Some of them are even 6 digits of tons of cocoa beans per year to process them, to press the butter from it, to take the cake, to make later in even sometimes bigger factories chocolate. So at the beginning, you have a smallholders group, and at the end, you have multinational companies and huge supermarket chains which sell the products on the shelves. And we have a huge variety of products on our shelves here. This is a picture from a supermarket just around the corner here. What does that mean for pricing? Typical for many agricultural products is a decrease of inflation-adjusted prices. This year, this is the blue line. This is the inflation-adjusted price for cocoa, and you see how high it was. There was a crisis in the 70s, how high it was in the 70s, and that it went down, down, down for a long time. It touched the lowest point, inflation-adjusted, but also in real terms, around the year 2000. And strange coincidence, the year 2000 is the first year where you saw a lot of reports of children and even slave labor in cocoa production in West Africa. From then on, the price never recovered back to the levels it had in the 50s, 60s, and the 50s, where the song came from, I quoted, and the 60s, and even what it had in the 80s. It didn't recover to that until a few months ago, which will be something for later. Now there is a steep increase in cocoa prices. Who sets the price? And now we come to the human rights aspect. It could mean that price is set by what a farmer needs what a farmer needs to produce cocoa in the future and feed his or her family. But in reality, this is a snapshot from this morning. This is the price making, the futures markets in London and New York. And there you see that the price presently, this is in British pounds, is very high, quite different to what we saw before. But even here, the question is, are these prices orientated at the well-being of people? No, they are not. Are they orientated to guarantee a future of cocoa production? Also not. The high price we have presently in cocoa is not only due to climate change, but also because in the last years, prices were so low that farmers couldn't invest in their plantations. No fertilizer, no pesticides, not enough labor. And harvest per hectare went down already a couple of years before we have this disaster of the ongoing harvest. The futures market is not interested in this. It's supply and demand, it's speculators in it, and prices go up and down, and nobody asks for the well-being of farmers. I will contrast this now not with the Lieferketten legislation we have in Germany, with the due diligence legislation or the European legislation, but with a much older thing, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this said already in 1948 that everyone who works has the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existing worthing of human dignity. It also says, and this is again the definition of living income, similar to the song from Ghana, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services. So the discussion we have now with the legislation is how it started because we saw that in many value chains, human rights were not part of a price setting, not part of a wage setting, not part of the purchasing practices of companies, contrasting to what we saw in the Human Rights Declaration and what we saw in other declarations of the United Nations. In the United Nations, they hired John Ruggie, who was a professor. He died a few years ago. and he was a special representative on human rights and transnational corporations at the beginning of the last decade. And he defined due diligence. And he said that governments are responsible for human rights within their countries, but companies have to avoid to if the government failed to profit from these failures, but there is a due diligence of companies. He said this at a time when nobody in the companies was really looking at it, except for a very few companies. When his report came out in 2009, I took his principles, the Ruggie principles, and made a questionnaire and sent it to chocolate and cocoa companies. And most of them, they didn't answer my questionnaire, but they told me in letters that they are not responsible for human rights because they only buy cocoa in the harbors and not at the farm. That was the answer only 14 years ago. So we have a mind shift due to the fact that this led with these Ruggie principles, they became the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. They were adopted by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. And then they became also part of the OECD due diligence guidance for companies, for multinationals. That was before it came into legislation here. There was a clear message from the UN and from the OECD that governments have to change their legislations. If you embed responsible business conduct into your policies and management system, you can't rely anymore on the cheapest price, because you often know that the cheapest price comes with human rights violation. Everybody in companies knows that. You have to identify and assess risk in your value chain. You have to tease and prevent and mitigate impacts. You have to track implementations and results. You have to communicate and provide for remediation systems. And this shifted the discussion in the cocoa sector. For a long time, for example, a company like Nestle denied that there's child labor. And when I saw an interview a couple of years ago with a leading person at Nestle, and they asked him, since when do you have child labor in the value chain? And the person said, since we bought the first cocoa beans. So this is a shift we have seen in the last years. And this led to the legislation we have now in Germany. But the German legislation at some points is weak because it's only for people, for companies with more than 1,000 employees. And it has a typical German wording where an enterprise has to become active if there are actual indications that suggest that violations of human rights related or environmental related obligation at indirect suppliers may be possible. So there was a huge lobby pressure. I was in many of these discussions to have it as vague as possible. Without indication, no action. There is an institution for BAFA who has the supervisors. The problem the cocoa sector has that there are widespread reports and studies on child labor. The last report from 2020 was that 1.5 million children work in the cocoa sector in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Most of these children, like in 70% of working children globally, of 160 million, will work in agriculture because there's the highest price pressure. And most of these children also in the cocoa sector will work with their family. And poverty is an important cause of this. I've seen, for example, already 15 years ago, a study in Ghana where they asked families with working children, why are your children not at school? And they said it's because of poverty. And when they asked them, what do you want for your children? They said as many school years as possible so that they never have to become a cocoa farmer. That was the answer of 80% of the farmers in this study. The children, they suffer from back pain, from cuts, from snake bites, all you can imagine. They miss school. Malnutrition is widespread, and they produce cocoa, a luxury good for us here. But my headline here is symptom child labor. Child labor is a symptom for the pricing we have in the cocoa sector. Now we come to the definition of a living income, which wants to avoid this. It was already mentioned that there should be an annual income so that they can afford a decent standard of living with families, for food, for water, for housing, for education, healthcare, clothing, and so on. This is the definition of a global living wage coalition. And it's based on the already mentioned anchor methodology. Richard and Martha Anchor, two retired people from ILO and the WHO leading positions, they developed this. And they did it at first for wages, and there you have a cost of food, housing, and so on, and you can calculate a living wage. The more difficult thing for a living income for farmers is that they sell products and not labor. So it's not a hourly or monthly wage. It also has to do with volumes and price for the products, with the costs they have for production. How much land is available? If you make a living income calculation, say every farmer should have 10 hectares of cocoa, but a family cannot work on 10 hectares. They can only do 2 or 3 hectares with family labor, and they don't have this additional land. The living income calculation is far away from reality on the ground. You have to look into farmers' knowledge and skills, into infrastructure, access to inputs, financial services. What makes things again more complicated when the discussion about wages, if roads improve in the cocoa growing region, transport will become cheaper, transport of cocoa, but also transport of goods. So it is interlinked with government policies. What is also part of the calculation is the consumptions in the household. What we have to stress here with a living wage and a living income do not mean that you live in the middle class. If you see at the calculation for Ghana here, it was in the banana sector, there should be a decent roof, a decent wall, a decent floor in a house. But they calculate here 36 square meters for a family of average of 4.5 people. So this is not middle class, which is bare minimum standard we talk about. And even this is new for many agricultural value chains. What we did in Ghana and in Côte d'Ivoire, we made a data collection. And again, it's minimum standard. What's the cheapest variety of food, of vegetables, of meat, and not what do people prefer to eat? So the calculation was made in 2018, and the results showed that only 9.4% of the families in the cocoa growing regions lived above a living income. The average and the median were half of a living income benchmark, or even below. Côte d'Ivoire, you had the same results. Nigeria, Cameroon, name it. And you would have similar results if you do it for coffee in many growing countries, if you do it for mangoes, if you do it for avocados, and so on. Agricultural value chains always had this pattern that there is non-organized group of producers, which with very low bargaining power. What we brought into the living income discussion was the question, how much would it cost? Because when we came with the living income calculation, some people here and from the industry in Germany said, if cocoa gets too expensive, people can't afford chocolate anymore, and then the farmer would suffer even more. I calculated this year with a price level of $2,400 US, like we had it for years or even below. And during 2022, it was only 5.4% of a bar of chocolate which went to a farmer in Ghana. So 5% of a average selling price of €1. If we would double what a farmer gets, a bar of chocolate would at that time have gone from €1 to €1.05. Industry declared that's not possible. It's not possible to do this on a market. Now we have inflation since a couple of years. We have significantly higher chocolate cost. And if I go into the supermarkets, it seems to be now no problem to sell a bar of standard chocolate for €1.39, €49. And if I see what companies published during the last years, despite COVID, despite Ukraine war, despite inflation, many of them published record profits over the last year. So there is a window of opportunity to bring the living income debate with the ongoing legislation and the high cocoa price into the sector. Last slide, what we need indeed, according to the legislation, a risk analysis on human rights due diligence, and that will show that you have risk in all major cocoa producing countries. 2 or 3 years ago, I got a job to make a risk analysis of all the big producing country, and the industry told me, but show us some countries which are not a red or a yellow light, but green. There was none. The internal analysis of companies, I know it of a couple of companies, had a similar result. And this is cocoa, but let's do it with cashew. Cashew is fruit, which is now, Côte d'Ivoire is also the biggest exporter globally. It has even, I think it has even a higher risk. I haven't seen the internal, I've seen some internal papers of companies, and they are of a similar opinion. We need more knowledge about the value chain as a precondition for this risk analysis. If I want to do a risk analysis, I have to know where the cocoa comes from. That means I can't buy in a harbor anymore. I can't buy from an anonymous trader anymore. I need a known value chain to tackle human rights violations and deforestation. To do this, I need a different sourcing strategy. Spot markets are not controllable. And nobody who buys somewhere and does not know where it comes from should be able to import cocoa in Europe anymore during next year due to the deforestation legislation. And we need a similar pressure concerning human rights. What we need are long-term relations between producer and producer organizations and buyers. And higher prices are, from my point of view, the only way to reduce risk, not only in cocoa, but also in other products. This is an ongoing debate now, debates about what companies should do accelerated during the last years due to the legislation. And very, very tiny pilot projects, indeed, to reform markets. We will see an upscaling in the next 1 or 2 years. Some companies are already starting, because the only way to tackle these problems is to give the people a higher income. And in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, roughly 70% of the income of the families comes from cocoa. Last words about companies, programs, and how sufficient are they? You mentioned the Nestle program. Nestle adds 500 Swiss francs per family to these few families. It's 10,000 they have now, but it's few compared to where they source from, to the income. But in the last report, they say there is still a gap of $3,500 to a living income. And either you have to go with much higher premiums or with a higher price to tackle this, and the legislation will put the pressure on this. Okay, that's it for the moment. I nearly made it in 20 minutes, not completely, but Alex Assanvo will continue where I stopped.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think it's perfectly in time, and yes, you showed a lot of challenges and where the sector is not as far as they or could have been, but the problem has been is obvious by now, I think. And now we hear from His Excellency Mr. Alex Assanvo about one approach, how at least the 2 biggest producer countries, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, try to solve it. And Mr. Assanvo is the first executive secretary of the Côte d'Ivoire Ghana Cocoa Initiative, which was put in place in around 4 to 6 years ago, and he is appointed in that position since 2021. And beforehand, you have worked in the professional sector. You have worked for Mars and Mondelez. If I see it correctly, you have also worked for Fairtrade and started at some point with the GIZ, the German Development Corporation. Everything related to cocoa, sustainability, and yeah, developing markets for smallholders. And hence, we are very interested to learn about your perspective and your insights, how to tackle the problem. Please go ahead, Mr. Assanvo.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. And thank you for everyone to be in this call. So it's very interesting, and thank you, Friedel, for some of the insight you mentioned. So I will not spend time on it, and I will focus on what the two countries have done. So in 2018, we had one of the initial big crash of the cocoa market. A lot of speculations, a lot of defaults from the buyers, a lot of problems, and this has forced the two presidents to come together and suggest, representing over 60% of the global supply, why the two countries cannot influence price, how the two countries cannot make better to give something back and higher income to farmers. This is where everything started in 2018. 1 year after, the two countries, after a lot of reflections, have decided to come with a price mechanism, which is called living income differential. And the living income differentials have two principles. One is to define what's the value of cocoa, already in 2018 and 19. What's the value of cocoa? So they look at the cost of productions and different costs associated to cocoa. And I'm talking about only normal cocoa. We are not talking sustainability, but cocoa. So they built this and came to an agreement, both countries, that average for 1 hectare of cocoa, the cost normally should reach a point of $2,600. Now, how do we reach it? If the current market price is going around $2,000, $1,800, $1,900, $2,000 up and down, very volatile and fluctuated market. So they came with the idea to look for a mechanic that give a floor price of $2,600, which is being subsidized by a $400 premium. This $400, despite market volatility, will always bring us to $2,600, which were announced in June 2019. And from there, the first cocoa price in 2019 was succeeded and welcomed by everyone because it gave farmer a much higher price, which is around 25–30% increase for the base price. They were very happy. 2 months after, despite everyone, so European Union, a lot of politics, government, everyone say, wow, this is good. Government of Côte d'Ivoire taking the responsibility. The industry say, yes, we will do it, we sign up for it. 2 months, 3 months after, the industry have stopped buying cocoa. So chocolate brands have stopped buying cocoa. Some have even diverted where they buy cocoa. So they were not buying from Côte d'Ivoire, they were buying from other countries in the region. So Cameroon, Nigeria, and many other places. So diversification has started. So the countries decided to push hard, called the industry, and then suggested, if you are not helping us implementing this price mechanism, we are going to remove your license to operate in our country. So the industry kind of come back. And what we saw, it was a different fight. So everyone say yes, but sorry, government of Côte d'Ivoire, the market is the market. Why? Because the country premium, so every cocoa in this world is associated to a premium that goes from $1 to 300 pounds, to $400 roughly Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And this premium certainly we have seen that Cote d'Ivoire cocoa has been discounted. Ghana cocoa has been discounted from plus 220 pounds, almost $300, or 280 euro, to minus 200. So that means that if you sell Cote d'Ivoire, you sell your cocoa is being discounted by almost $400, which is exactly the premium we wanted to have to support price. That is built on the way that this is directly paid to farmer. This is $400, is not taxed, it's included into the farm gate price. And this were fully mechanized and published every year. But for that, then we saw in the market, and then the industry said, sorry, this is the market. So today, when we look at the experience we had, we have seen companies diverting the sourcing, so changing where they buy cocoa. No one stopped them. We have seen companies pretending that the market has looked for a way to offset the price mechanism that we developed. 3, we have seen companies accusing Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to disrupt the market. Friedel said earlier, supply and demand. The market is based on volume of cocoa. If there is more cocoa, the price goes down. If there is less cocoa, the price goes up. So that's only what is important. And then we have been experiencing it since I came into my role in 2021. The price of cocoa was 1,800. So we were pushing hard. So we put a lot of discussion with the industry. We have aligned that there are few things that need to happen. The industry has no influence on the markets. The market is mainly composed by a bit some of the industry, chocolate companies, etc. But cocoa, like many commodities, when we talk commodities, they are influenced by speculator, banks, investment banks. And these people are not even targeted in any of the legislation. They are free rider, but they are the ones who are designing the price mechanism. So the industry said, well, there's not much we can do. We try to figure out. For us government, origin countries, what is important is building a model that protect farmer and that protect the price paid to farmer. We see today that when I read all the regulations, we see that there is a pretty good recognition that farmer income is important, living income is important. And we have been asking that for so long. Now, how do we link that with legislation? And I think that's probably where we have to look at. And Friedel said, we have students that are becoming future directors, future leaders in private sector. But one thing we need to reflect is how a sector can deliver a product that covers at least cost of production, what we were asking for long. Because cocoa has never reached a point where farmers were paid the basic, the cost of production. So how can we talk about human rights? How can we talk about everything environmental if we are not even able to deliver the minimum income back to farmer? Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are selling cocoa forward because we want to protect farmer, and because of the flow and the movement of cash, the two countries are selling forward, so in advance a year. As Friedel says, spot is very risky, require a lot of cash, a lot of money. No one has this money. But if you sell forward, you can sell a little bit, and the average is what helps us putting price, and 70% is what we are giving back to the farmer. So the lower the price is, the difficulties is for us, because we have no influence to give higher price to farmer as long as price is low. First time ever, we have very high price. As Friedel mentioned, the price is floating around $9,000, $10,000, 3 times what we were even asking 3 years ago. But why? This is simply because there is no cocoa. So a farmer that have 20 hectares, probably today is producing less than 5% of his production because of climate change, because of very bad practice, because of no investment the past 30, 40 years in cocoa. Despite government efforts, cocoa is not competitive to any other crops. I gave an example in Ghana, for example, as we speak, there is a lot of illegal mining of gold. So people are destroying cocoa farms. Some farmers are lucky. The people come to them and say, I give you $10,000 and get out and we will dig in your farm. The farmer accepts $10,000. He couldn't even have it in 10 years. But he accepts because he has to look for his children. He has to look for immediate short term. So it shows that sustainability is key. Protecting farmer is key because everything is related to poverty. And I think we have seen there are two areas the legislation is not touching. I was listening to the presentation of Dr. Saha. The mechanic of the London Exchange, where price is being defined, where price is happening. So it's based in the UK and New York. Both are not part of European Union. We are not looking at cost of production. So how can we talk all these models that everyone will talk about? It's not even profitable because even when you say cost of production, but you need to have a margin for profit. If this profit is not reaching what farmers need to survive, cocoa is still becoming non-competitive. And then we have another issue that is coming. We, Africa, have been for too long being exporting only products. Today, we have the cost, the inflations and everything. Ghana has an inflation for over 40%. In Europe, when we reach 3%, everyone is saying, wow, catastrophe. This is a disaster. We are above 40% inflation. So for everything you import costs you money. So maybe the country has started reflecting, can we produce what we consume? And if we have to export, it has to be relevant for the countries. And I think that's key because it shows that the trends we are seeing in cocoa, the price that is very high. I think when we said $9,000, Friedel was very, very nice by saying, well, 3,000, etc. But $9,000, if this is the price that is being maintained and people are going to pay, this is probably will change the sector. But as we speak, I can tell you that the priority for the industry is to increase the cocoa production. Because the more you have cocoa, the more the price is going down. And I think this paradigm is very interesting because the market is supply and demand. And we all want to protect people and planet, but this is not part of the market. This is not part at all of the market. So maybe companies can do, but the market itself, where the price is being defined, doesn't take in consideration sustainability requirement. And on top of that, investors who are majority into the speculation, the banks and all of them, so far, only very few look a bit of sustainability. But the interest in it is very low. And I think in the study and reflecting on regulation, if we are not able to change the business paradigm, I fear that we'll create even more disaster. Because for us, in the Friedel presentation, we saw that we have smallholders. These people will not get a market. They will be rejected from the market because everyone will look for the best, the traceable, the everything perfect, which is plantations. And then all these millions of farmers that we saw in the presentation will be lost. So we have to transform the sector so that it becomes relevant. People need to produce more on less land. Because if a farmer goes into forest This is because the land he has is not productive anymore. And it's easy because protecting forests is very low. Then it's easy to go somewhere and then plant. And if you look today as we speak, protecting forests is not rewarded in Africa and everywhere. And I wish for a day where protecting a forest need to be rewarded so that no cocoa farmer will enter into forest. No rubber or any farms will go into forest. And I think that's the paradigm we have to change. Today, we, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, see regulation as an opportunity. However, it's also a challenge because we are observing two things that are happening. Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana is doing traceability, is doing transparency. We are forcing companies to tell where they are buying with polygon mapping, national map, etc. And then you have other countries near Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana that are not doing it. What is happening? People are coming and buy cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, smuggling to other countries, Liberia, Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Togo, and others are also going back to Cameroon, Nigeria, cheap cocoa with no request for diligence. So the new diligence that are happening could be an opportunity for us to protect these countries, because if they are not protected, not only for our interest, but they are going to lose the forest. And forest should not be where cocoa should continue to grow. Cocoa need to grow in a rural development area and plan program, full traceability, full mapping, where everyone agree. But if nothing is done, and some countries are trying to reject regulation right now, it will be very unfortunate, and we'll continue to experience the climate change as it is right now. If there is no cocoa, there's lack of investment, but there is also impact of climate. So the mechanism we put together has helped protecting farmer. Now the price is high. This mechanic is becoming a minimum guarantee. So at least if the market crash, we have a level where price of cocoa will not go. And we are going to review these numbers. The floor price is going to be reviewed because it was made in 2018-19, and almost 5 years after, inflation, cost, and everything has changed. So this floor price is going to be reviewed. So this is a bit my experience that I'm sharing. And again, the only way we can change companies' behavior is by regulation, not only origin, so we producing countries, but also importing countries like Germany, who is one of the biggest importer of processed cocoa. But it's important we look at where changes can be made. Investors, banks, we need to look also on the market function. If it's about talking about only supply and demand, then no need to do regulation because nothing will change. So this is, from my experience, I can guarantee if you're not willing to push very far the reflection and only look at what we, the exporting country, have to do, it won't be enough to protect people and planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting, but also, yeah, kind of daunting forecast, because you said much more needs to be done in order to protect people and planet. And to the opposite, at least here in the EU, we kind of see, yeah, that the sustainability legislative approaches are struggling or are stalling, and there may be even rather a pushback. But yeah, on the other side, we see that at least the EU Commission and the DG Development, they are very committed to their cocoa initiative. And yeah, I think they were really hoping to make a success out of that. But taming the market and the market volatility is probably a big challenge. And supply and demand is driving the market. And yeah, currently the supply is short, so prices go up. But the question is, what happens when supply becomes larger again? And maybe if new and other countries or producers step up, or these circumventions via smuggling into countries that don't take legislation so strongly. So there are a lot of challenges out there, and yeah, I think a lot of questions have arisen. We have already 3 in the chat, and I can only motivate everybody either to raise a hand or to open up the mic and ask the question, or just post them in the chat, and we will go through them one by one. And I would like to start with the first question, where it's a question: what's the current situation of child labor and livelihoods at the moment in both countries? So I assume now with the prices so high, does this make an impact or make a difference? But if I understand it correctly, probably not, but because the problem is that high prices indicate low supply, and low supply means that the farmers cannot sell a lot, and hence probably cannot benefit from the high prices. But maybe you, Mr. Assanvo, or maybe Mr. Hütz-Adams, you can give us a little bit more perspective on that.
No, thank you. And I think I will give the floor to Friedel probably to add. That's a good question. What is the situation of child labor? I think there is an overstatement when we say child labor. I think we need to be careful what we are saying here. There are very clear definition of the ILO, International Labour Organization. So when we say child labor, is a simplification. But in fact, what we are saying is forced labor, which represents roughly 3% of the cases in cocoa. So the noise around child labor is overstated. But there are child laborers. Child labor because there's not enough schools, there is not enough infrastructure, but also sometimes because there is not enough schools, some parents have to bring their children 5 kilometers to schools, and they prefer not. So therefore, what is being done is an education process, a lot happening with companies, with government, to assure that farmers are well educated on children not using difficult tasks in farms. So when a children is being seen in the farm during school time, this is becoming. So I will say that all this is just make definitions, but Professor, you mentioned very clearly, we see big numbers in price of cocoa, but you have to understand that the cocoa that the companies are using in the chocolate right now is cocoa they bought last year. They have been buying it last year at $2,000. And the chocolate company are increasing the price of chocolate because they say the price of cocoa is high. But most of them, I gave an example, Mondelez is covered, so will not buy any cocoa until 2026 because they bought what they need. So, but they have increased the price of chocolate. This is another area Europe need to look at. The increase of price of chocolate, with the accusation that this is because of high cost of cocoa. And then secondly, yes, many farmers will not sell much cocoa this year. They will have probably less revenue than last year. And therefore, I fear that if not much is being happening in the cocoa sector, and we cannot stabilize the cocoa sector longer term, the issues we are talking about, environmental issue, human rights issue, will not be less. It will continue being a challenge. And I think that's the paradigm we are in now. So where the company want to be, can any company, let's say they do all the programs, can any company come up and step up and said, I'm going as a company to buy whatever the market is, I will buy my cocoa with the minimum guarantee price, whether it's a fair trade reference price or whatever price, that cover cost of production, cost of profitability, everything. And I can tell where I'm buying cocoa. Here's the global map, and this is the map of Côte d'Ivoire, official map, where forests are, and I can show where the farmers are. Can any company do this? No. Because companies want to have flexibility. They want to be able today to buy in Côte d'Ivoire, tomorrow to go and buy in Nigeria. And I can tell you, every company sustainability program, none of the company buys 100% of the programs. They have a program and they have a sourcing strategy. The two are two separate issues. This is things we can't sit and talk about. Tomorrow, I would like you to invite a company and say, yes, Nestle, you do an accelerator program. Are you buying all the cocoa from your program? No. Why not? Because it's difficult, because of A, B, C, D, quality, etc. Yes. But the farmer is doing everything and is not able to sell it. So that means that is at the same level as someone who has not done anything. So I think reward, stability, and creating more transparency will be critical for us to deliver. So to come to the answer, I will say that 6 months high price will not solve all the problem in cocoa. If we want to have a cocoa that bring good farmers, we need to have at least a 2 to 3 years high price as we see now. Then we can say yes, child labor. As long as we have only price that started to be up 6 months ago, and farmers have no cocoa, and there are a lot of diseases, I fear that this is a dream by just thinking all the problem will be solved because price of cocoa is high. No, it has to be long term. I don't know, Friedel, maybe you want to add something.
Yeah, I also saw the questions in the chat concerning fair trade. Well, but I want to start with the child labor. Child labor is a very delicate question because there are many figures going around. There are problems. There are governments being afraid that in the future they might not be able to export anymore because there's child labor included. So it is a delicate question. But I had one experience in 2017 which shows where the problem lies. For 3 or 4 years, we had a cocoa price of $3,000, and that ended in 2016. There was a bumper harvest in Côte d'Ivoire, where was suddenly a very good harvest, a few 100,000 tons of cocoa, which came unexpected onto the market. Partly due to the fact that during the civil war in Côte d'Ivoire, many protected areas were cleared of natural forests and planted with cocoa, and this came into production now. But we had no deforestation legislation, so it was no problem to buy it. And companies went into the country and prices went down from $3,000 because of big supply to below 2,000. And in spring 2017, the guaranteed minimum price guaranteed by the pre-selling with the cocoa bots in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, it went down by 1/3. So from one day to the next, 1/3 of the income of a farmer was gone. And by the way, the government had to cut its budget by 10% for all ministries because of the lower tax income. Yeah.
Yes.
So I was one day on the conference there by the government and all the companies in the room and ministries and so on. And the first day there was a speech about child rights from UNICEF. And the second day I started with a presentation of the price development, and I said, well, price will stay low for a couple of years, because there is so much surplus that all the stocks are full. And when a woman stood up in the audience and said that she's fed up with the discussion about child rights, because when the next harvest starts in October, her choice is either to send her children to school and not be able to harvest part of the cocoa, because at that price she cannot hire adult laborers, and then not to know where to buy food from for the family, or to take the children out of school, to send them to harvest, to sell the cocoa, and to put food on the table. Yeah? If this is the choice a women cocoa farmer has, and we talk about human rights, the issue is that the price went down by $1,000 per ton. A few days later, in the luxury hotel in the Radisson Blu at the airport in Ivory Coast, there was a conference of the industry. And on that day, people from the industry entered the stage and they said, oh, our company, they give 30,000 for 30 million for social project. The next came, oh, we give 50. Oh, we pledge 1 billion for the next 10 years. And I said, hey guys, I was speaking afterwards, prices went down $1,000. harvest is nearly 5 million tons. So for one season to the other, you save $5 billion in buying cocoa. And you come up with a couple of 10 millions and say you will save the farmer? This is the discussion we had before the legislation. And everybody in the sector knew that if the price goes down by $1,000, 1/3 for the farm gate price, there will be more child labor. Yeah? Everybody knew that, and nobody discussed, should we do something against the price decrease? And now this, I want to connect with a fair trade question. Fair trade has a minimum price. This minimum price is much too low to guarantee a living income, much too low. And for many years in the last decade, world market price was above it anyway. And they pay a premium, but only if they sell their cocoa with label, if they find buyers. And they found only for 1/3 of their certified cocoa, they found buyers on average in the last decade. So the impact of the minimum price and of fair trade premium was very low, only a few % more income for farmer. And this with this big gap. Fair trade reacted on this by setting up something called LIRP, living income differential.
Referential price.
Yeah. So companies could decide to pay a couple of hundred during the last years when the prices were lower, $700–800 on top on the of the price and of the premium. But only very few companies made it. The big exception is Tony Chocolonely. They even spend more money on project to support farmers, and they have set up. They started as a startup with 20 people 8 years ago, and now they have a turnover of, I think, 130 million euros, and became a startup which is very successful. But companies didn't take up this LIRP, this differential by fair trade, which would have an impact. It's still too low according to my calculation, but it would have had an impact. Why didn't they take it up? I'm in discussions with many companies, not only from the cocoa sector, and usually the question is not what would help the farmer or what would help the worker. The question is, what are our competitors doing? Huh? And I have been in discussions with a company, and they already 7–8 years ago, they planned to set up a long-term stable value chain for a German retailer for the private brand. And when their bosses came and asked, how much will it cost extra? It was a few €100,000 per year, so not much for a multi-billion company. And then the question was, what do our competitors do? Oh, they work with labels. How much does it cost to work with labels? Oh, not a few $100,000, but a few $10,000 per year, euro per year. And then they went for label. Now, within the same company, you have a discussion with the legislation, which says, are we protected against human rights violations if we buy labels? And the answer is no. So now they start again the discussions we had 8 or 9 years ago. Shouldn't we set up a stable long-term value chain with a price which is significantly above what fair trade is paying? We should have had this much earlier, but again, the benchmark for companies, and that's all sectors, I had discussion in clothing industry, in shoes, and cars. The benchmark for the sustainability departments of all companies is what do competitors do, and not what's necessary. And therefore, we need the legislation.
Okay, thank you. So would you say then that the legislation, the EU level or the German legislation, does make a difference, and that it will force a paradigm change on companies, or how will the companies react?
So I will say that companies, Friedel said it very clearly, companies don't want to lose competitive advantage. So legislation, if they want to be impactful, need to have a very clear reference, because by just saying at least a living wage or living income without any reference, then it's make it difficult. So I think we need to have scientifically based reference, as Friedel started to outline. it's very clear that cost of production, cost of profitability, cost of compliance, these are things we can have average data and it can be adapted by countries, etc. But if there is very clear scientific references, then no one could come and say, oh, well, me, I'm compliant because I'm paying this. But what's the reference? And I think that that's where we have an issue. And this is where probably European Union were struggling because they said, we cannot put anything on price because we don't buy directly. And if needed, we have bilateral agreements. And it has started to become very complicated. And this is why the European Union has removed it. The problem is if you don't have any reference. And we government, for example, we have put a reference. But when companies are not doing it, then what the European countries or union is doing. And I think so far, this is one of the problems we are trying to figure out. There is no reference on exact number on price. There is no reference on this. There is very vague statement that could lead to some confusion and over or misleading claims from companies. Yeah.
And to add this, a strange thing in the discussions about the European legislation, not so much about the German legislation, because many companies in the sector opposed the German legislation. They wanted to have a European level. But many companies in the chocolate and cocoa sector, they publicly ask the European Union to be strict in their legislation. You can see the published letter they did with, for example, the NGO with Network Voice. Yeah? The same with the EUDR, with the deforestation legislation. Companies are afraid that if the rules are not strict, competitors will not follow the rules. The moment they don't follow, they might be a little bit more profitable, so that shareholders go there. They might not be able to compete to produce the private brands for retailer and so on. What's happening already, I mean, the legislation is quite new, but what's happening already is that there is a lot of more pressure also within the companies. And suddenly you have at meetings where you discuss about sustainability, not the sustainability department anymore, or not alone, but also the procurement department. You have, I already said that the German legislation, not at least due to pressure by lobby, is very vague. So I was in one meeting with the purchasing department of a big company, not only cocoa, but many other products, and a lawyer, and their discussion was, Friedel, can you explain us the risk? And when they asked the lawyer, who will be sued if we have a human rights violation? Because the law is so vague. Will it be the company? Will it be the responsible person for the procurement department? Will it be the company head, somebody in the board who is responsible for procurement? Even the lawyer didn't know. And this leads to changes. It's not the sustainability department anymore alone, which is asking for transparency, for protection against human rights abuses. There are responsible people in companies now who are aware that they might have a problem. And this in itself is a very important step, not only for the cocoa sector, but also for other sectors. What will follow now in the next years, it depends on how the German supervision board, the BAFA, will react. They are already sending out letters. There is a TV report about, it was about Lind and child labor in the value chain, and I can guarantee you that Lind got a letter from the BAFA. The question is, what's happening afterwards? And we don't know yet.
Okay, so yeah, you say that the EU legislation and also the German legislation has an impact, but in its formulation, it's still too vague, and a lot depends still on the interpretation or if the companies can kind of dodge away. And they are much more interested what the competitors do than what really how the legislation is interpreted. I mean, another proposal is that maybe antitrust legislation could be changed in a way that in particular this cooperation among companies could be further enhanced or allowed in this specific respect. What is your perspective on that? Is that something that could help?
I think that's a very good idea. I think for so long, antitrust or competition law have been a barrier to engage, for companies at least to engage, but also for companies to use it as an argument to do nothing for too long. And I think that's an area probably to explore, or at least we could think about government. So we have the example in France where there is 2 laws that have been put in place, the Legal 1 and 2. And also recently, the French Parliament have been agreeing to finalize the law on setting a floor price for any product produced in France to protect farmer, to at least cover the farm price and also the profitability, to avoid farmer losing really some of the cost into the market competition. So these are things that need to be looked. But the antitrust, that's something, yeah, we need to deep dive. But again, it has been, and it is right now, one of the biggest barriers to bring companies together.
Yeah, but it's only one. I will come back to this. But what we see in the cocoa sector, we have a company like Barry Callebaut handling 1 million tons, so 20% of the global harvest. One company. Another million is Olam. Another 800,000 tons is Cargill. Another 700,000 tons is Ecom. And then you have 2 more with 300,000 to 400,000 tons, Sugden and Dupont. If you would have such a market concentration with a European product, the cartel bureaucracy would be on it. But as we buy it from Africa, we are quite happy when we get it cheap. Huh? So what we need to discuss is how to share data. One of the things companies often say is that the legislation is very bureaucratic and cost-intensive. Part of this is not the fault of the legislation, but the problem that companies try to protect their knowledge. Dozens of companies have had made risk analysis of coffee, of cocoa, and so on. I made one paid for a couple of mid-range companies, and we published it. And it was so boring because I knew that the departments of big companies have made the same by PricewaterhouseCoopers, by EY, by Maplecroft, by I don't know whom. So the same knowledge was collected alone for the cocoa sector at least a dozen times in Germany and paid for, instead of publishing it or having it done by the umbrella organization, by the BDSI. They want to destroy the legislation. They don't want to work with it. That's a problem with many umbrella organizations. If they would have shared the knowledge on the risk analysis, they could have saved a lot of money. In other sectors, it's the same. And then the second point is companies are now commissioning studies on a living income. We made this one. I was part of a company group in 2018 for Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and it was published. And one of my jobs was to find out who could do it. And then I learned that one of the major companies had already done exactly such a study 2 years before, but nobody who was involved was allowed to talk about it. So we spent taxpayers' money to do it again. And now different companies are in different countries doing the same studies again for coffee, for cocoa, and so on. They are not sharing. The same they do with their projects. What is successful in increasing farmers' income? Productivity increases are definitely not, because farmers simply cannot afford it and it would ruin the price. So how can we combine efforts? Why do we have to set up so many pilots? Why we are not combining things? Huh? And then you have to listen to them and they say, oh, it's so bureaucratic and cost intensive. It's so inefficient what the industry is doing. This is something I had to learn when I came as an NGO man to closer contact to the industry, to learn how inefficient they often act and say, yeah, because it's competitive, we can share. This is not only cocoa. You can do it in all different things. And so there is a big room for improvement. They hide behind cartel laws. The cartel bureaucracy in Germany, the people involved, they already said for bananas and for textile, and also there was, of course, paid for, a lawyer made it, there was a statement that they are allowed to share, for example, information on living income. They are not allowed to share how much they want to increase the price. But if you discuss a living income and your result is that on average you need so and so much money for an average farmer, everybody can calculate the price. You don't have to talk about price. And by the way, in Germany, we have a minimum wage by law.
Okay.
So there is a wide room, also for political movements here in Germany.
Yes, there is a wide room for political movements and for research, and also maybe to get international research organizations stronger involved to make a transparency and data offensive initiative on that. But there is one final question, and if you have 2 more minutes, I would like to address that final question, and it's about the ownership of the value chain, the leadership in the value chain, and also about who can, if investments in storage or processing in Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana may help. And one thing that you said, His Excellency, Mr. Assanvo, was that some of the companies have bought cocoa already for the next 2 or 3 years, and they have it on storage, so that they are not so strongly affected by the high prices. And then that's really the question: could have storage in the producing countries more storage capacities or stronger value chain leadership in these countries? Could that have prevented such a situation, or could that prevent it in the future? Is that a useful avenue to go? And please, yes, let's 2 minutes, and then we have to stop, unfortunately.
Yes. No, thank you. I will respond quickly. I did reply already, but I can tell for everyone. Yes, it's possible, but we have to understand that we don't have the same climate condition like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Bremen, and also we are in the very heavy, humid environment, which require massive electricity, massive airing of the warehouse and all this. So stocking beans is not what we are looking for. We want to build more investment in building, and I think I was responding to someone from Fair Afrique just now. We want to push the processing in country. One problem we have, we don't consume. So if at the end, this is to produce chocolate in Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, a lot of companies are not interested, some very small niche. So what we need to look at is how to transform a big part of the processing in country, so that this can go, whether we reach the liqueur level, a high quality liqueur, which can be to respond to the question, stock for very long, because liqueur stock is like, oil and etc. So it's much easier with a proper tank with refrigerated and everything. But beans, this is not something that have been showing successes in our continent. So due to the heaviness and the quality issues, and also other problems due to the weather. So there are a lot of paradigms we are looking for. And I think at the end, so is how do we build more consumption of derivative product from cocoa? There's a lot of health value for cocoa, flavanols and all this. But again, the continent is not consuming at all. And we rely so much to the European. And I think what we need to look at is to build a mutual value chain. We give different values and venues for us to reflect where we can look at it. Because if not, well, we can't go like many other commodities. The climate change will massively impact value chains. Things will be extremely high in cost. And cocoa might become only a luxury product, because right now, that's probably one of the paradigms even the chocolate companies are looking for. So there are a lot, and the cocoa sector for me will not be as it is right now. There's no way. So whether we want or not, a lot will change. And therefore, to respond to the question, yes, investment is key, and we will continue to promote. So we are processing 45% in Côte d'Ivoire, 35% in Ghana of cocoa. So that's already a lot, but we want to do more, and not just beans and price taker. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hütz-Adams, do you also want to add some final statement?
Yeah, also, I have to agree that chocolate is difficult because we are here, for example, we are used with a Milka or a Rittersport, they taste like we are used them to taste. And for this, you need to mix beans. So if you want to produce a Milka chocolate in Ghana, it might even be possible that you can't use Ghanaian beans because they have too much aroma, and this good quality you cannot use for Milka. Yeah? Or only a small part of Ghanaian quality in it. So yeah, it is difficult to make chocolate, but intermediate products like liquor, would be something to store.
Yeah.
And also a problem is how to tackle climate change. It might be possible that half of the production areas, and these are some projections, are in West Africa, are lost till 2050. With coffee, half of for production in Brazil will be lost also until 2050. So this is something we will see in different value chains, and perhaps with this we will come to, alone by this, to much higher prices. The problem is what to do with a farmer who can produce cocoa anymore. What do they produce? Will the governments change cocoa policies which are concentrated on cocoa more for the local market? Will they try to produce imports? Ghana imports 800,000 tons of rice per year and export as much cocoa. So how do we find a balance? That will be a big challenge for agricultural policies in all producing countries. Also here in Germany, if we look at the weather we have now.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much to both of you for these really interesting and insightful interventions. And also interesting how we started with due diligence. And I was actually internally thinking that living wage, living income, I mean, that's a challenging topic. I think you totally confirmed that. But on the other side, it showed that we moved way beyond living income, living wage. We moved to market analysis and questions of research, and it's a much broader topic where due diligence is one element of that. And I totally agree that I think that the agricultural economists, for example, they do not look sufficiently on markets, astonishingly, any longer. And I mean, there are some markets that are analyzed up and down all the time, but the cocoa market for sure is one, and in particular, these competitive problems that has seen much less attention in recent years, even though a lot of livelihoods and a lot of potential also for improving collaborations along value chains and raising it to a new level is seen there. And so the due diligence legislation, and that's what makes me kind of happy, because we've seen here an example where it really makes sense and where it really can bring change to the sector. And it's an example where it was really important to have it. And a lot of work still needs to be done, but hopefully in the next years we will see more research work on that. And this is the last event of our public lecture series. And I think also with our lecture series, we put a little bit more spotlight on this research field of due diligence and how markets have to change in order to contribute to people, planet, and the environment and the resource protection and climate protection that's needed. And with this, I would like to thank everybody, also all those who have attended us during the last weeks. You know, there is a webpage that's online where you can see the recordings from the different lecture series and the PowerPoints, as in most cases. And so thanks again to everybody to join this lecture series, and in particular these two speakers of today, and Sarah Iweala for sharing their insights with us. Okay, and with this, I wish everybody a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dankeschön.
Yeah, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Yes.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Bye.
Yeah, tschüss. Bye-bye.
Ciao.